All right, so this one should be a little bit interesting. I want to look at trends in assimilation and pluralism in the United States post 1965. So to do that, what I kind of need to do first is walk everyone through a really short overview. I hope a really short overview of the civil rights movement, because this trend, right, what's happening with assimilation and with pluralism in the post 1965 U.S. is largely a function of the things that are happening in during the process of and in the wake of the civil rights movement. So let's start with there. Let's start with that. The civil rights movement is a period of time in the U.S. that encompasses sort of the emergence of these social movements, whose goal was to end the social, political, and economic discrimination toward oppressed racial and ethnic groups. There's no firm start date. Arguably, it culminates in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act and 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Maybe it ends in 1969 with Loving v. Virginia. Not quite sure, right? So there are different subjective takes, all of which can be, possibly effectively argued. I don't think it's that important to have a sense of definite beginning and a sense of definite end, so much as a sense of both the rough span of time that we're talking about, as well as the things that are going on during and afterwards. So what this really kind of represents is an effort to overturn the Jim Crow era. So we've talked about this before, but just to summarize, right, we had the establishment of a racial caste system in the British American colonies in the early 1700s, kind of coming out of the wake of indentured servitude, which in the 1600s was primarily a mix of European and African labor. Chattel slavery emerges beginning in the early 1700s, in part as a reaction to the increasing growing class consciousness among indentured servants and other people within the political and economic system of the British American colonies, who were not being particularly whose interests were not being particularly addressed by the existing dominant power structure, which was an arrangement between the colonial government and the planter class. And this sort of growing discontent culminates in a number of uprisings, probably the most famous of which might be Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. And in the wake of this, the colonial governments in the British American colonies realized we have to figure out a way to sort of maintain a pool of inexpensive labor, but also keep that pool of inexpensive labor from sort of bonding together and forming a sort of politically and socially active class who will pursue their economic interests, right? So what they do is, of course, they drive a wedge between the European laborers and the African laborers by sort of creating the racial categories that we understand today. So we get this first racial caste system of chattel slavery, race-based chattel slavery, which, as I said, begins to get institutionalized and formalized in the very early 1700s. That's in place all the way up until 1865. In the wake of the Civil War, we get a number of amendments that overturn both slavery and sort of the associated practices, but also that free the slaves, turn them into citizens, and guarantee them equal protection under the law. So that period of time between the end of the Civil War and 1877, that brief period of time, is what we call Reconstruction. This is when former slaves and their families and their children begin to sort of start businesses and elect political representation and sort of begin to enjoy some of the benefits of citizenship that had been denied to them um, um, because of their status as slaves. So that period of Reconstruction ends in 1877, and we get a second racial caste system that we call the Jim Crow era. And it is the civil rights movement that finally dismantles at least the legal and formalized structures of the Jim Crow era. We're still, even today in the 21st century, dealing with some of the legacy effects of that. So I want to kind of walk people through a set of events and a set of legal decisions that kind of characterize and describe how that civil rights process kind of moved forward. And obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but I'm assuming that most people have heard of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to point out that there was actually a relatively important landmark case that occurred almost a decade earlier in 1947 called Mendez v. Westminster. Now, this was a Supreme Court case in which the United States Supreme Court ruled that so-called Mexican schools were unconstitutional. Now, in California, they had a system of racially segregated public schools. There were schools for Anglos, and there were schools for people of Mexican descent that they called Mexican schools. And in 1947, Mendez and a number of other plaintiffs sued to have these segregated schools struck down as unconstitutional, and that is indeed what the Supreme Court ruled, mostly relying on what's called the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Equal Protection Clause says that people are guaranteed equal protection under the law. If you're a citizen of this country, you're guaranteed equal protection. And the idea is that a segregated system meant that people were not being treated equally, right? That Plessy v. Ferguson back in 1896 had sort of established a Supreme Court precedent that separate but equal was consistent with the principles of the Constitution, but anybody looking at the quality of these Mexican schools or the quality of racially segregated schools for Black students in other parts of the country, clearly unequal. And so Mendez v. Westminster is the first case in which the Supreme Court strikes down that Plessy v. Ferguson precedent. The final nail in the Plessy v. Ferguson coffin, of course, was Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. And again, that had the effect of ending the constitutional protection for racially segregated schools. Now, I want to point out, this is not really in the outline, but I want to point out that when these Supreme Court decisions come down, very often communities do not respond by immediately doing things like desegregating their schools. We'll talk a little bit about the desegregation of Little Rock High School in 1957 in just a moment. But one of the things that that communities did in response to being ordered, in essence, by the Supreme Court to segregate their public school systems was to create private schools for white students. They became known as segregation academies. And the way you maintain the racially segregated quality of these schools is, for example, you might make admission to these schools a function of what we call legacy. So if your parents went to that school, then you're allowed to go to that school. If your parents didn't go to that school, you can't be admitted, right? So this is a way to ensure that going forward, these schools will remain racially segregated. So that was one of the responses. And segregation academies are still, up and running in a number of states, primarily in the former states of the Confederacy, so in the South and the Southeast of the United States. But that was one response. So a lot of schools do desegregate in the wake of Mendez v. Westminster and Brown v. Board of Education. But there is a little bit of a backlash in which people who are committed to maintaining racial segregation begin to get very, very creative with regard to how they do that. So I just wanted to point that out. Around this time, specifically 1955 and 1956, we get the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So it isn't all just Supreme Court cases. There are also demonstrations and all kinds of other forms of political activism that are going on. And the Montgomery Bus Boycott is a really good example of one of these actions. So it was a 381-day boycott in which organizers and carpool drivers who were facilitating that boycott of the bus system were arrested, right? So a lot of people went to jail over this. Probably the most well-known person sort of associated with the Montgomery bus boycott was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was arrested in December of 1955. She was not the first person to be arrested, but the plan was to have a number of people be arrested for refusing to give up their seat to white passengers. In May of 55, for example, Claudette Colvin was arrested for doing essentially what Rosa Parks would do later that same year. The way this works, and a little bit of background information here, back in the 1940s and the 1950s, most bus systems, most systems of transportation were not public systems. They were private companies. We get municipal transit services really start to get much more widespread in the 60s and 70s. But back in the 1940s and 50s, a lot of these companies were privately owned. And they were especially dependent on fares paid by African American passengers in these southern towns in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and places like that. The reason for that, of course, is that the rate of car ownership among African Americans is really, really low relative to whites. So blacks are much more likely to use the bus than whites are. Nevertheless, the policies of these companies favored white passengers, right? So if you're an African American and you're sitting in the front of the bus and a white passenger gets on and asks you to move, they usually didn't even have to ask, right? Everyone just knows that the policy is you get up and you move to the back of the bus. You have to surrender your seat to a white passenger. And civil rights activists were looking to change that, and they knew the way to do it was to hit the companies where it hurt, which was in their profits. So you can't simply just give up riding the bus, though, right? Because that's how people get to work. So what happened was, before the arrests of Claudette Colvin in May of 55 and Rosa Parks in December of 55, the organizers of this planned boycott spent time in the community. They spent time in the local churches and other places, and they gathered lists of African Americans who did own cars and who were willing to provide carpool services for the people who would no longer be riding the bus. And so they did a whole lot of work up front, up to and including planned arrests, right? So, Rosa Parks wasn't just some random elderly African American woman who got on a bus one day and was too tired to give up her seat. That was the plan, right? That she would get on the bus, she would sit at the front. When a white passenger got on, instead of moving, she would refuse to move, and the law enforcement personnel would arrive, they would arrest her, and that would sort of galvanize the community to begin boycotting the service. And again, it worked, right? 381-day boycott. Eventually, the company is like, okay, we're going to change our policies. So I want to, when we talk about the civil rights movement, I want you to understand that it's a multi-pronged approach, right? It relies on legal proceedings, ultimately many of those resulting in Supreme Court case decisions that were favorable to the civil rights movement, but also direct political action, marches, demonstrations. Most of them predominantly peaceful, nonviolent, non-cooperation, as was being promoted by the organizers, people like Martin Luther King, but also people like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and some of these others who had been really, really inspired by the nonviolent, non-cooperation strategies that had been employed by Gandhi in India's resistance to British colonial rule. So he was, Gandhi was a significant influence on this civil rights movement in the United States in terms of the tactics, but also in terms of just, a grassroots multi-pronged movement designed to create social justice and social change. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about the desegregation of Little Rock High School. So let me just say a couple of things about that. So in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education, right, local school districts were instructed that they were now required by law to desegregate. In Arkansas, the governor, a guy named Orville Faubus, I'm not making this up, that was actually the guy's name, Orville Faubus, he refused. He was, we are not going to desegregate Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas schools, right? And so, so the president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, mobilized the 101st Airborne, and he nationalized or federalized the Arkansas National Guard. He basically enlisted the state troopers, or the state National Guard, because ultimately they're under the jurisdiction of the armed forces. He federalized them, and they were going to enforce the desegregation of Little Rock High School. And so the next year, I talked about backlash earlier, the next year, Orville Faubus closed all Little Rock, Arkansas high schools. There was no high school no high school classes in 1958 in Little Rock, Arkansas. So committed this guy was to maintaining segregation, even after he was told that it was unconstitutional to do so. He insisted, right? So the schools did eventually desegregate, but understand that people who were the beneficiaries of a kind of racial hierarchy in which white people were at the top were very, very reluctant to shift and to accommodate these newly changing laws. 1961, another really good example of political activism, were what were called the Freedom Rides. So as a legacy of separate but equal, as a legacy of the Jim Crow era, bus stations, right? Interstate bus stations. So like think of Trailways, think of Greyhound, right? Think of these interstate bus companies. In the South, the terminal facilities, right? So the buses would make regular stops for fuel so people could get off and use the restroom, stretch their legs, buy a little food. Those facilities were racially segregated, right? So you'd get on a bus in a Greyhound bus in Boston or in New York or in Hartford or Philadelphia, and you would travel south. By the time you get into Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, right, Mississippi, Alabama, your terminal facilities are racially segregated. So you get off the bus, and black passengers have to go into one particular place of the terminal, which was substandard and below the quality and cleanliness, and had fewer amenities than the area that was reserved for white people. So the Congress of Racial Equality, the organization that we call CORE, C-O-R-E, is the Congress of Racial Equality. So CORE organized in 1961 a series of rides in which people would get on the bus, they would get off at these facilities, and then the black passengers would go into the white parts of the terminal, knowing that they were going to get attacked, knowing that they were going to get beaten by law enforcement and by other locals kind of pushing back against their efforts to sort of desegregate these facilities through demonstrations and political action. So those were a series of rides, and again, they brought press and media with them so that people in the North would sort of see the mistreatment of people that was occurring in the South, because a lot of people in the North really had no idea, or if they had been exposed at all to stories about this, they were downplayed. They were not that important. But the idea was that if we can show the mistreatment that's occurring, then maybe we can galvanize additional support back in these northern states, so the politicians would get behind things like, again, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, which were kind of being proposed and reproposed year after year and getting successively shot down. Near about that time, so maybe a couple of years later, specifically 1963 and 1964, you get what's called the Birmingham Campaign. Birmingham was at the time the most racially segregated city in the South. Martin Luther King and other organizers put together what they called selective buying campaigns, that black shoppers would only shop at black-owned businesses, right? Depriving the white-owned businesses of the commerce. And this went on, as I said, for 2 years, 1963 and 1964. So the selective buying campaigns are significantly starting to hurt the economic interests of white business owners. The sheriff of the sheriff of Birmingham, Alabama, was this guy named Bull Connor. Bull Connor very famously sort of turned dogs loose on and aimed fire hoses at protesters, sort of promoting the Birmingham campaign. You can see some of those images if you just do a quick online search for Birmingham campaign or Bull Connor, and you'll see sort of graphic images of what the response to this selective buying campaign was. This is, of course, when Martin Luther King gets arrested. He's put in Birmingham jail, and very famously writes Letter from Birmingham Jail, in which he excoriates white liberals for not joining in the cause, right? Preferring a relative quiet but unjust social order to the kind of uncomfortable feelings that demonstrations and confrontations produced in them. And it's a kind of a nice indictment of people who sort of sit on the sidelines, and King is making the point that your neutrality really isn't neutrality. What you're doing by not taking a stand, by not joining in and fighting on behalf of your African American brothers and sisters, is you're tacitly approving of their oppression. And it's a really, really stirring and really, really important piece of correspondence. Also in 1963, we get the March on Washington. The actual long title for the March on Washington is the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice. This is where Martin Luther King will make his I Have a Dream speech, which is probably the speech that he's most famously known for. The organizing of this event was really, really significant. There was a slate of multiple very, very impressive speakers. The primary organizers, again, are A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, two names that probably don't get nearly as much attention as MLK. Not to take anything away from Martin Luther King, but if you want to read about the people who actually put this movement together and organized it, you should read up on A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. These are really, really important figures. Bayard Rustin, mostly not known because he was gay, and people were worried that the authorities and the media would use that to sort of delegitimize the movement. And so Bayard Rustin sort of works behind the scenes, and he's much more quiet, but really is significantly one of the most influential people in the organization of the civil rights movement overall. And he's kind of always there in the background and behind the scenes. So the goals of the March on Washington included an end to discrimination, obviously, and segregation, obviously, but also things like job training, the expansion and increase of the minimum wage and a more formalized minimum wage, a broader application of what was called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was designed to sort of regulate the treatment of employees by employers, and the idea was that needed to be expanded, and its application to discriminatory treatment in the hiring and employment of African Americans needed to be much more rigorous and much more consistently enforced. So very, very important event, literally right on the doorstep of well, not literally on the doorstep, but just right across the mall from both the White House and the Capitol building, so that politicians had no choice but to be aware of these issues, because the idea was, we're going to bring this to Washington and we're going to basically call out the leadership of this country and say, we're waiting. We need progress on these things. And again, that was 1963. 1964, big year we have, obviously, in 1964 is when we get the Civil Rights Act passed. But in the ongoing efforts to sort of build a racial justice movement, we get Mississippi Freedom Summer. Mississippi Freedom Summer was an attempt to register as many blacks to vote as possible. Many blacks had not registered to vote because they correctly surmised that even if they showed up at the polling places, that the Jim Crow laws that had been in place since the end of this sort of period of Reconstruction would be used to continue to disenfranchise them. But the idea was that, in the wings, there was this Voting Rights Act that was potentially going to be passing. And in fact, it does pass in 1965, the year after this. So the idea was, we want to get as many black voters registered to vote as possible, so that if we are able to sort of have free and fair elections in which the participation of black voters would not be suppressed, there would be enough voters to sort of elect more progressive legislators or more liberal legislators than the conservative political power structure of the Jim Crow interests and the Jim Crow system. Notably, outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, during Mississippi Freedom Summer, 3 civil rights workers who had been registering voters, 2 of them white, 1 of them black, Cheney, Schwarmer, and Goodman, were murdered. They were arrested outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. They were held in the Neshoba County Jail. They were not released until after dark, and until after, of course, the local law enforcement notified the Klan that they had these 3 guys. As soon as they were released, they were pursued by the Klan. They were stopped. They were murdered, beaten and murdered, and then they were buried in a dam, a little earthen dam. And the disappearance of these civil rights workers, again, resulted in a massive sort of wave of publicity that brought attention to the lengths that people were going to prevent blacks from exercising their political activity, their political rights to vote. So I think that helped to sort of galvanize support for the Voting Rights Act, which, again, as I said, passed the following year in 1965. 1967, Loving v. Virginia. So one more Supreme Court case, and I'll kind of end it there. And again, this is just a gloss, a little overview. You could literally do a whole semester just on the civil rights movement, that roughly 30 to 40 year period from the 1930s to the 1970s. There's so much going on. I'm just gonna give you some of the highlights here. So Loving v. Virginia was a Supreme Court decision that overturned what were called anti-miscegenation laws. So in 1967, it was still illegal in 13 states, including the state of Virginia, for blacks and whites marry, right? Miscegenation refers to mixing of races. So there were a number of statutes on the books in these states that said, we're not going to recognize these marriages. So the couple sues. That goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, you can't do that, right? You can't fail to recognize the validity of a marriage that is legal in one state in another state. So they struck down the remaining anti-miscegenation laws. So even though most people see 64 and 65 as the really, really big years in terms of achievements because of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and again, those are really significant advancements. Loving v. Virginia shows that there were still things on the books that needed to be addressed. And look, the struggle is not really over, right? We have in the Voting Rights Act, for example, what was called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which dealt with this thing called preclearance. And the idea was that if you were a state, because states run elections, right? So states administer even federal elections at the state level are kind of run by the state. So if a state had a history of racial discrimination in voting, any changes that they wanted to make to their voting practices and policies had to be cleared by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, right? So that you could not do these things. You couldn't, for example, change voter registration policy unless you had pre-cleared those changes with the Civil Rights Division, who would look at it and say, will this have the effect of suppressing minority votes? So that Section 5 was a really, really important section of the Voting Rights Act. And a few years ago, in a case called Shelby County, who was it first? Shelby County is the plaintiff, and I can't remember the defendant. But again, a Supreme Court. You just look up Shelby County. The Roberts Court, right? So John Roberts is the Chief Justice, so we call it the Roberts Court. The Roberts Court struck down that preclearance requirement. So basically now states can change their voter registration policies in ways that create racial suppression, right? Suppressing the votes of racial minorities. And there's really nothing that can be done. It's like that section has been, the formula has basically been negated. Now Congress can create a new formula for Section 5 that would allow it to be sort of reinvigorated or revitalized. That has not happened yet, right? So that's one of those things that Congress ought to do. Certainly, it's within Congress's power to change the way that they apply that Section 5 pre-clearance requirement. So the Voting Rights Act hasn't been struck down, but that particular section has been kind of neutralized, pending some changes and tweaks by Congress, and then of course the Senate signing off on that as well. So my point is that although the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights era, established rather significant gains for African Americans and for other racial and ethnic minorities in the country, the idea that somehow that struggle stops once you get a couple of significant pieces of legislation like the Civil Rights Act, like the Voting Rights Act, I think that's a misunderstanding, right? That these things, there are always forces out there that want to claw those gains back. And it's really, really important, of course, that people continue to put pressure on government, both at the local level, but also the state and the national level, put pressure on government to make sure that our systems are in fact not disenfranchising people based on ascriptive characteristics like one's race or one's ethnicity. There's some other stuff I want to talk about. I want to talk about Black Power and Afrocentrism. I also want to talk a little bit about the Chicano movement and Dreamers, but this video is already about 30 minutes long, 35 minutes long, so maybe I'll save that for the next couple of videos, and in the meantime I'll just leave it here, and I'll say see you next time.